Hi everyone. In this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon, we're going to be looking at a very famous game played between Magnus Carlsen and Alexander Grischuk. This was played in the 2009 Linares tournament in Linares, Spain, and without further ado, let's look at this game. Carlsen on the white end starts by playing e4 and c5 by Grischuk, the Sicilian defense. Carlsen goes knight f3 and d6 by Grischuk. And here d4, cd4, knight d4, this is all normal stuff. Knight f6, knight c3, and after a6, bishop e2, e6, it has become the Scheveningen variation of the Sicilian. And here Carlsen just decides to castle, get ready for development, usually with bishop e3. Maybe later on he could continue with f4 and somehow get an attack towards Grischuk's king. And Grischuk develops all the same, a4, knight c6, bishop to e3, and now castles. So Grischuk also develops his pieces, and at the moment he's getting ready to play moves such as bishop to d7, maybe queen to c7, and perhaps later on trade this knight on c6 for the d4 knight, and maybe maneuver this bishop on c8 to c6. So for the moment, that is the plan that Grischuk has, and for Carlsen, it's to push f4 and get an attack. So he does that. And here Grischuk just brings his queen out with queen to c7, and Carlsen just plays king to h1. It is always a useful idea to move your king away from this very long diagonal, which can always be used as attacks toward your king could pile up. So Carlsen just immediately moves his king away, making sure that he is not going to be in the line of fire towards maybe this queen on c7 or this bishop on e7 later on in the future. And here, rook to e8 by Grischuk, getting ready to tuck his bishop back into f8, maybe also getting ready to push e5 later on. Here in this specific position, d5 isn't that easy to play, but later on Grischuk could even try to play that move. Bishop to f3, Carlsen develops his bishop out, and he's looking towards that long diagonal from h1 to a8, and bishop to f8 by Grischuk. And this bishop f8 move not only tries to protect the king, but it could also be used later on to fianchetto this bishop to g7 and then perhaps use it along this diagonal, while Carlsen is using his light squared bishop along this diagonal. Queen to d2, Carlsen develops his queen, and rook to b8 by Grischuk. And an idea with this rook to b8 move later on in the game is to perhaps capture on d4 and then push b5. Obviously, the idea of b5 can always be to play b4, maybe later on weaken the e4 pawn. And after that, you could say that Grischuk definitely does have an advantage after he plays b4 and attacks the e4 pawn more. So that is what he tries to do. Carlsen plays queen to f2, perhaps trying to play knight takes c6, or maybe just prevent b5 by moving the knight away and then just playing bishop to b6, where in the case you would stop the b pawn from advancing. So e5 by Grischuk. This does weaken the d5 square, but at the moment Carlsen can't really utilize this a lot. fe5, fe5, and knight to b3. At the moment the threat is mainly to play bishop to b6 and prevent b5 by Grischuk. But also another idea with this knight b3 move is to later on get this knight somewhere where it can use the f5 square. Maybe not even just this knight, but also this knight, and maybe this bishop on f3. Even these two rooks can later on use the f-file to their advantage. So knight b4 by Grischuk, and here bishop to a7. Carlsen doesn't play bishop to b6. Instead, he plays bishop to a7 first, with the idea of just making this rook on b8 a little less active. Grischuk forcefully moves the rook to a8 and bishop to b6. And here, Grischuk plays the move queen to e7. And Carlsen ceases the file by playing rook a to d1 and bishop to e6 by Grischuk. Bishop to e6 could be to perhaps get more control over the d5 square, since Carlsen was threatening moves like knight d5. So with bishop to e6, Carlsen still plays knight d5, but now Grischuk manages to get this e4 move in. So after d6, queen e6, we can see that both sides have passed pawns. Grischuk's being the e pawn and Carlsen's being the d pawn. And it's basically a matter of who can use their pass pawn more effectively and who can basically use it to their advantage and win by using their passed pawn. Knight c5 by Carlsen, attacking the queen on e6. The queen goes to f5. And here, bishop to e2. Grischuk decides to trade the queens and play knight bd5. And here, a5 is played by Carlsen, defending the bishop on b6. If you go for d7 here, then Grischuk is just happy to play rook e to b8. And now, if you queen here as Carlsen, then Grischuk will capture the queen, and after bishop takes d8, there's bishop takes c5. And Grischuk just went from being down the exchange to now going to get a lot of material. Right now, you can see at the moment he's threatening rook takes d8. He's also threatening, if this rook moves to a wrong square, a fork on e3. So this practically forces rook takes f6 from Carlsen's point of view. And now Grischuk can save his knight by playing knight f6. And after knight takes f6, bishop takes f6, g takes f6. If you assess the material, you can see that Grischuk is up one pawn. It is doubled, but perhaps this pawn could still be utilized some way or another. And now Carlsen has more or less equalized the position. So instead of playing the move d7, a5 by Carlsen. Carlsen is not willing to equalize the position. He's willing to make the position completely advantageous for him. Knight takes b6, a takes b6, and rook a to b8. Rook takes f6 now, g takes f6, and knight d7. And this is a very nice idea by Carlsen. Basically, he's giving Grischuk the option of which rook he would want to lose. He can either move this rook on b8, and he would lose the f6 pawn and in turn lose the e8 rook, or he could save this pawn and give up this rook on b8, and he decides to play f5. And here, Carlsen does not actually capture the rook on b8 immediately, as you don't really need to capture the rook. There's still the threat of knight f6, so instead he plays c4. And with c4, Carlsen is trying to bring more pawns towards the queen side, where there would be threats of queening than if there was just the d pawn there. So with c4, Carlsen is trying to play c5, b4, and then get a pawn chain that will protect the d6 pawn nicely. a5 and c5. And Carlsen is only going to capture the rook on b8 once you see how Grischuk defends the f6 square. And Grischuk does this by playing bishop to g7, and that is when Carlsen captures the rook. And here, I encourage you to pause the video and find a very brilliant move that Carlsen played in this game. This is probably one of the most famous moves that Carlsen has ever played, and it really shows you how you can utilize an advantage when you have essentially 3 connected passed pawns. Okay, so the correct move is to play bishop to a6. And the reason why this move was played is actually to capture on b7. Now, bishop takes b7 is not the immediate threat that Carlsen has. It's also to bait Grischuk to play b takes a6 in the case that Carlsen can then respond with c6. And you notice that this pawn trio over here is easily able to queen, and Grischuk in return cannot really do anything about it. So he cannot capture the bishop, so he plays bishop to f6, hoping that maybe he can defend the d8 square, and in that case maybe prevent some of the pawns from queening, even if it means he has to give up his bishop. So Carlsen played bishop takes b7, and now rook takes b7 by Grischuk. c6 now, and now Carlsen is just ensuring that there's no way that Grischuk is going to save the position. Grischuk captures the b6 pawn, and Carlsen was willing to actually sacrifice one of these pawns so that he could push the other ones. And here, this is another critical moment in the game. What would you play here if you were Carlsen? Rook to c1. And rook c1 basically ensures that the c pawn is going to be pushed. And it's a c pawn because pushing the d pawn isn't really that helpful, because this bishop on f6 is guarding that square. So here, after rook c1, Grischuk is completely lost. And at this point, he's very desperate to try something that or another that could actually change the outcome of the game. So he tries bishop takes b2. But Carlsen doesn't even move the rook. He just plays the move d7, and after this was played, Grischuk resigned the game. There's really no way to stop this pawn from queening. That is why after this move, d7 was played, Grischuk resigned the game, and a very brilliant victory for Magnus Carlsen. So I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comments section, and stay tuned for more chess.